It's just literally end of last week it came out. It's called Planet of the Humans, and it's by Michael Moore. He's the executive producer. But I thought we'd have a listen to a clip of it now. This film, which has come out on YouTube, it's there for, I think, another 2.5 weeks for people to watch for free. And it's really about the hijacking of the green energy movement and the environmental movement. So let's have a listen to a clip from that now, which talks about some of the finances involved in green energy. I mean, just as a sort of one of the most important take-homes from the film is that we think of green energy as being things like solar power and wind power, whereas what he shows in the films is that this solar power and wind power, much of it is just doesn't last very long. I mean, they need to be replaced, these solar panels and these wind farms, but most importantly, they only represent a tiny fraction of what is now called green energy. One of the biggest and most important parts of green energy is what they call wood chips, which actually ends up being basically wood-fired power stations. And many environmentalists don't seem to have realised that the new fuel for the future is about destruction of forests and rainforests to fuel these new biomass plants. But anyway, let's have a listen to a clip from that new film, and it's called Planet of the Humans.
My guest tonight is on a global crusade.
On a global crusade for what?
Commit to divesting from fossil fuels. We can't justify investing our money in companies that are basically running Genesis backward.
So when you divest from fossil fuels and invest in green funds, what are you investing in? I took a deep dive into Securities and Exchange Commission filings to find out. For instance, in the Green Century funds, recommended by 350.org and Bill McKibben, I found less than 1% solar and wind, and 99% things like mining, oil and gas infrastructure companies, including a tar sands exploiter, McDonald's, one of the companies driving meat consumption across the planet, Archer Daniels Midland, one of the world's largest producers of biofuel, Coca-Cola, the largest creator of plastic pollution on Earth, logging and paper companies, including one that brags about biomass burning, and banks. Lots of banks, including BlackRock, the largest financer of deforestation on Earth.
The business that they're engaged in is actually destroying our life support system.
The Sierra Club also partners with a green fund called Aspiration. Aspiration also includes dozens of companies profiting from the destruction of the planet, including Chevron, ExxonMobil, Chesapeake Energy.
In order to maximize the production potential of the well, the shale formation will be hydraulically fractured.
The Russian gas giant Gazprom.
Gazprom owns the world's largest explored gas reserves, 36 trillion cubic meters.
And in perhaps the most bizarre twist of all, the Sierra Club's Green Fund's biggest holding is Enviva, the world's largest consumer of forests, to be incinerated in green energy biomass plants. Of course, one investment option is a green fund run by Bill McKibben's buddy, David Blood. And who was the chairman of this fund? Someone familiar.
Use capitalism that gives incentives for people to do their best.
Al Gore and David Blood partnered to form a company called Blood and Gore. No, scratch that. Generation Investment Management. And within this fund, Blood and Gore designated a special investment category, targeting $650 million of biomass and biofuels. Funny thing was, they partnered before Al Gore's film came out. Was that movie just about climate change? Or something else? You might ask yourself, how could men destroy what remains of nature to enrich themselves? Well, that's why they're billionaires, and you're not. The takeover of the environmental movement by capitalism is now complete. Environmentalists are no longer resisting those with the profit motive, but collaborating with them. The Nature Conservancy is now the Logging Conservancy.
We will capture the most important pieces biologically, and there will be another large block sold to timber investment groups.
The Union of Concerned Scientists has become the Union of Concerned Salesmen, having taken millions not for science, but to create markets for electric cars. The Sierra Club sells electric cars and solar panels right from their website.
The best thing about Sungevity is that they make it easy for you. All that you have to do is to say yes.
The New York Times partners with ExxonMobil to bring you the good news about biofuels.
Algae-derived fuel could help us meet growing demand.
Treehugger.com, which claims to be the largest single source of environmental news, was founded and funded by Georgia Pacific, a logging company. In fact, they are neighbors. Georgia Pacific is owned by our friends the Koch brothers, who are likely the largest recipient of green energy biomass subsidies in the United States.
So that's Jeff Gibbs there. He's an environmentalist working with Michael Moore as executive producer on this new film, Martin. Really does paint rather a bleak picture of the environmental movement as of being rather sophisticated manner, rather cleverly hijacked.
Well, it's been going on for years, hasn't it? I mean, it's called greenwash. They claim to be green. Basically what they're doing there is exposing these ethical funds, green funds you can invest in, which basically are invested in all of the stuff they're talking about, which is about as green as you can imagine. I mean, the biofuel stuff, that's been being pushed for years. And of course, in developing countries, you need land to grow food for people. If you turn it over to biofuel, you then drive people off the land and they end up in the favelas and so on. I mean, in places like Brazil.
About in the film is the way that vast areas of Brazil have been turned over to sugarcane.
That's right. Monoculture.
Mass evictions at gunpoint of indigenous people.
Yeah, exactly.
From the country.
So what you really need, the problem with mainstream green thinking, and of course, you've got a big spectrum there. There's more radical Greens, and there's more, people who claim to be Greens who are basically CEOs of major companies and hedge funds. But you've got to challenge the basic property rights of capitalist society. In Brazil, they need a land reform. They need ordinary people to be able to grow food on the best land in the country. It shouldn't be turned over to soybean production, biofuels, sugar, or any of that. And that requires a revolution. There was a revolution in places like South Korea after the Korean War, in Japan after the defeat by the Americans. There was a land reform. Ladayinsky, who used to be the major person who was responsible for land reform policy in the US, was eventually pushed out, Wolf Ladayinsky. But of course, ultimately, that's the solution for A, third world poverty, and B, to get a green economy. You've got to have a land reform revolution in the developing world. And of course, things like biomass, which basically use the best land to grow stuff to be used in power stations, that is not the way to go. It's the exact opposite.
How do you think it's been that so many environmentalists and people from the green movement have been dragged along with this? It seems to me that there just seems to have been, a very clever PR campaign with things like wind farms and solar panels. One great big project he talks about in the film, Planet of the Humans, opening in the United States, opened by Arnold Schwarzenegger. He then goes to have a look at this plant to see that it's all falling apart. Basically, it still just about works, but there's no maintenance going on. A lot of the solar panels and the reflectors are broken. That some of them are just lying there on the ground doing nothing. So it looks as if there's been a big attempt to make everyone get very excited about the idea of solar and wind power. In other words, not actually using any kind of fossil fuels or biomass, but this is covering up something much deeper, which is just a shift away from dependency on oil, really.
Well, I mean, the hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. 30 years ago, green ideas were marginal, and people who professed them were regarded as cranks. Gradually, they've come more into the mainstream, which has been good in a way. But of course, what happens then is that the mainstream basically recuperates what you're presenting. And who isn't green these days? Everybody's green. Donald Trump's green. We're all green. And of course, what it really means is we want to carry on doing what we've always been doing, but we want to pretend we're not doing it. One of the things, of course, that's been going on forever.
One of the things we have to cope with here in Bristol is this so-called green idea of burning our waste, including plastic waste, in incinerators in Avonmouth. And in the film, it points out that many of these waste burning plants, rubbish burning factories, actually they use a lot of natural gas, and also the coal-fired power stations that have been closed down have simply been replaced by natural gas, which again is a fossil fuel.
Yeah, well, ultimately, I would argue that what you need to do if you're going to reduce your pressure on the planet through carbon footprints or whatever it is you've got to go for energy efficiency and, of course, in the developing world, land reform, so that people can actually grow their own food and not end up in mega cities with coronavirus spreading and other diseases and all the rest of it. But that requires ultimately huge changes in the way society is organised. And what we've got here is basically business as usual, pretending to be something else.
Okay, so I'll put a link up to that on our show page. It's Jeff Gibbs and Michael Moore's new film called Planet of the Humans. It's about an hour and a half long, and I found it absolutely riveting because it shattered some of my illusions, and that's what it does what it says on the tin. And also, the other thing I quite like about it, Martin, is the way that there are lots of experts appear in the film, but they're not necessarily the ones you're used to seeing on TV. He's really found some fascinating people who are very good on this subject, anthropologists, etc., at various universities around the US, and one or two geeks who just happen to be very good at understand the way things work. But anyway, our final item tonight is we're going back to look at the Nazi war criminal Martin Bormann, who was tried in absentia at the Nuremberg trials. Lots of question marks about what happened to him, whether or not his body was discovered in 1972, a month after there was a revelation from Stuart Stephen, who was a Bristol-based Western Daily Press journalist working at the Daily Express, that Bormann had been photographed and discovered in Buenos Aires in Switzerland. Now, this just wasn't any old war criminal. Martin Bormann was